Hello, my name's Patrice Arend, and with me today is Nicole Foley. We are partners in the Employment and Labor Practice Group with Jaffe, Rate, Hewer, and Weiss. And we wanted to provide some additional information about COVID vaccines. Nikki and I did a podcast back in February. We talked about vaccines, whether they can be required, and that is posted on the website in the COVID resources for the Jaffe Law Firm website at jaffelaw.com. And we discussed in that podcast the ability for employers to require vaccines and what the various exceptions are for individuals who may have a disability or a sincerely held religious belief, what factors employers should consider in examining those requests. And we also discussed in that podcast practical, more human resource type reasons to think about before an employer decides to actually mandate that their employees get vaccines. And since that time, we've had some developments, some additional recommendations by the CDC, and some additional questions about quarantining. And we thought it would be useful to do a follow-up podcast to address those additional issues. So Nikki, I don't know if you want to just start out briefly before we get into quarantine type issues. If there's any implication, recently we heard about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine being put on a temporary hold, and if that hold impacts at all some of the previous discussion we had.
So I think that our position is the same relative to whether or not employers should mandate or strongly encourage vaccinations. And I think that what is going on currently with the J&J vaccine sort of bolsters that recommendation. We talked about in our last podcast how, one of the reasons why mandating may not be a good choice is because there is still so much sort of stress and anxiety related to vaccinations. There are people who don't believe in them. There are still people who don't necessarily believe that COVID is real. And that was sort of the human factor in these decisions. And I think that because of what's going on with the J&J vaccine, there is probably some heightened hostility, or employees would feel hostility toward the employer if they were required to get the vaccination. And, Patrice, you and I had talked about the fact that, what's going on with the J&J vaccine is it is just paused. They're looking at it, further from a scientific perspective, and the risks are still incredibly low that there would be any side effect. But because of everything that's going on in the media and television, I think that there is, again, a heightened sensitivity to whether or not employers should be mandating the vaccine. And I think that people are going to say, another reason that I don't want to do it is because of what's going on. So that's just something new and kind of different that has happened since our last podcast. But I think otherwise, all of the things that we discussed previously still stand today.
One of the things that changed after our last podcast, and then we put a slide on the end of it, at the time of the recording, the CDC did not issue any recommendations with respect to what happens if you've got a vaccinated individual who's been in contact with somebody who has tested positive for COVID-19. And literally within days of that podcast, the CDC, in fact, had issued some guidance. And so mindful that, this area is changing frequently, and there may be additional changes after the date of this podcast actually goes live. But one of the issues that the CDC addressed is if you have an individual who is vaccinated and they come in contact with someone who tests positive for COVID, do you need to quarantine that individual? Do you need to quarantine that employee? And the answer is no, but there's three things that the has to be satisfied in order to say that employee does not have to quarantine. And the first is that employee has to be fully vaccinated. So fully vaccinated means it's been 2 weeks since you have either received your 1-dose Johnson & Johnson vaccine or 2 weeks after you've received both shots for either your Pfizer or Moderna. After that, you're considered to be a fully vaccinated individual. The other requirement is that you have to remain asymptomatic. As we know, based on the science reported, is that the vaccines are not 100% effective. They're 90 to 95%, and there are individuals who still test positive to COVID after they receive the vaccine. So as long as they are asymptomatic, they're not exhibiting any of your typical symptoms of COVID, that would be another requirement. And then finally, it has to be within 3 months of your last dose. So if you had your dose, depending on when you became eligible, if you had your dose back in January, you may actually be beyond, depending on what date in January, may be beyond that 3-month time frame, in which case, according to the CDC, even though you received your vaccine, you would have to quarantine because it's been over 3 months since your second dose. Now, again, that is something that is changing. There's additional information that I have heard recently that talked about with respect to one of the European vaccines that they're seeing immunity for up to 6 months. So that recommendation should be monitored, because the CDC may further revise that as we have more and more information about the efficacy of the vaccine. So the short answer is no, they don't have to quarantine. Your employees don't have to quarantine if they've been vaccinated, provided that they satisfy those 3 things. So I didn't know, Nikki, if you wanted to add any of that and maybe even touch upon, do the vaccinated individuals come to work? Do they still have to follow the company protocols?
Yeah. So one thing also to add before I get into the continuing to follow protocols is, a lot of clients have asked about employees who have already tested positive for COVID. So in addition to those individuals who are fully vaccinated, there is also information from the CDC indicating that if you have an employee who tested positive for COVID within the past 3 months, and they too are asymptomatic after having come into contact with another COVID positive individual, they also are not required to quarantine. So it's sort of that similar timeline, that 3 months asymptomatic, those individuals also do not have to quarantine. So that's something else to think about. We get a lot of questions, with clients laying out the factual scenario. And so, those are 2 things that we get a lot of questions about. With respect to, again, anyone in the workplace, any workplace that is not entirely remote. So if you've got employees back at work, whether your employees are fully vaccinated or whether they have already tested positive for COVID, they still have to follow all of the MIOSHA protocols. So all of the social distancing is still in place. Use of masks is still in place. If you've got the shields in place, covering, desks, any of the separators, all of the disinfection protocols, all of those things still exist, even if you have a fully vaccinated workforce, or even for someone who is fully vaccinated and they're in the workplace, they still have to follow all those protocols anyways. Some
of the additional indications is people are traveling for work as well. And how do you deal with those issues when you've got vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals? If you've got a person who has been fully vaccinated, remember, fully vaccinated is 2 weeks after your last shot, whether it's a 2-shot or a 1-shot. You do not have to quarantine or get tested, self-quarantine or get tested. You still have to follow the CDC guidelines while you're traveling in terms of masking, social distancing, washing hands, and sanitizing. But as long as you are asymptomatic and don't have any symptoms of COVID and you're returning from travel, then you are not required to quarantine. And similarly, if you've tested positive within the last 3 months, those same rules apply. But if you're unvaccinated, the CDC still recommends that you only travel if it's absolutely necessary. And if you have traveled, then you have to quarantine. And the level of the quarantine, the amount of time that you're required to quarantine, depends on whether you've also been tested. So if you quarantine and you get a test within 3 to 5 days after your travel and you test negative, then you have to quarantine for the full 7 days after you've come back, and then you can go back into the office. Even if you test negative, you still have to quarantine for that full 7-day period. If you don't get tested, then you have to quarantine for 10 days before you can go back into the office. So the question that I've received recently is, you've got a client who doesn't want to mandate vaccines, wants to encourage them, but yet you've got employees who still want to travel and they have to quarantine because they haven't been vaccinated. How do you deal with those issues with those employees? Do you force them to use their PTO bank? And that's an issue that employers are struggling with. And the short answer to that is yes, unless you have voluntarily extended your FFCRA sick leave policy rollover and you've got something left in your bank for the quarantine, and you would probably dip into your PTO bank for that. I don't know, Nikki, if you want to add anything to that issue.
Yeah, I think that if employers need to consider whether or not the travel is being required, and if they're required to travel for work, I think that there should be additional consideration given to allowing for sort of free, use of PTO, that not being charged for PTO necessarily. But if employees are choosing to travel for social or for their own, personal reasons, then employers could implement policies that say, okay, you understand, you're traveling, it's not for work. You need to understand that when you return, you're going to have to quarantine and you're going to have to use, whatever PTO you have available to you before you can return to work. So I do think the situation could dictate how an employer responds. But, I have advised clients in both situations that as long as you are adopting policies and you're implementing them uniformly, so as to avoid any claims of discrimination, you can, there are differences, and you can differentiate between people who are traveling for work and who are traveling just for their own personal reasons, and how you might handle that quarantine period.
And I think in terms of being consistent and identifying a difference, if you've got someone who's actually vaccinated, but they have developed some of the COVID symptoms and need to quarantine, even if they don't necessarily have COVID, but they have a couple of the COVID symptoms, and it's advised that they quarantine nonetheless. Does that PTO, however you come down on your PTO policy, are you going to apply that as well for the person who has been vaccinated and still has to quarantine for whatever the reason is? Or is it going to be a benefit? That's sort of an incentive, and we can talk about that in a moment, but is that an incentive to get vaccinated, that if you get vaccinated and you have to quarantine or need time off to go get the vaccine, how are you going to deal with that in the PTO? And how do you differentiate between those type of employees, and how can you incentivize and how can't you incentivize those employees? Right now, there's no clear guidance from the EEOC in terms of what's permissible incentivization. And the potential risk is that if you provide incentives to somebody to get the vaccine, and someone can't get it because either they have a medical condition, a disability, a sincerely held religious belief, and therefore they don't get that incentive, is that a form of discrimination? And there's some case law that suggests that it is, especially if it's a monetary incentive. So I'm going to give you X number of dollars as COVID bonus, or however you want to characterize it, if you go get your vaccine. And there are some larger employers that are in fact doing that. And so just because they're doing it doesn't mean that that is entirely permissible. At the end, in the end analysis, based on the fact that they're dealing with a pandemic, it may be a way to chip away at the arguments, but at least it's undecided at this point whether that, in fact, at the end of the day, is going to carry the weight. But there's other potential strategies that we've advised clients in terms of how to incentivize. And I don't know, Nikki, you want to talk about some of those other ways to do that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I would strongly encourage employers not to use cash incentives like you suggested. I've gotten a lot of questions about that, either a cash bonus, or I've had clients ask if they could offer, gift cards. And, my answer is uniformly that would not be a good way to incentivize because of these concerns with whether or not it could be viewed as discriminatory against those individuals who cannot get the vaccine. I do think it would be permissible to incentivize employees as a way, again, to encourage the vaccine, to give free PTO. They don't have to use their PTO bank. They're given a paid time to go get the vaccination. I think certainly the time that it takes to get the vaccine, it would be wholly permissible to have that be paid time off. So I think typically if you said, okay, we'll pay you for half a day, you'll be paid for 4 hours to go get the vaccine. I think that it would not be any heightened risk to also consider maybe giving a full day off to get the vaccine. Again, it hasn't been, EEOC hasn't weighed in on it, so there certainly could be some risk if you gave someone a full day off of work. But I think that is it's an easier incentive to swallow than a cash, gift card or bonus type payment. So I think that, especially for people who are getting both doses, you could offer that as paid time off, either half day or full day. I think that another way that you could potentially incentivize people as well is it's not uncommon after the second dose to have flu-like symptoms. So rather than having to use sick time if you have to be off work because you're having symptoms that don't allow you to go to work, is to potentially offer some finite amount of time as, a free sick day. There is certainly the risk that employees will take advantage of that, even if they're not suffering flu-like symptoms. But, I do think that it's a risk that employers should consider taking so that people can say, okay, I'm not feeling well, I can't go to work because I've gotten the vaccine that you, employer, have encouraged me to get. And so maybe offering, one free sick day following that second vaccine is another way that you could incentivize employees. And then anything after that, they would need to maybe use whatever sick time they have available or whatever PTO time they have available. I think those are all valid mechanisms to incentivize employees that I do not think would run afoul of EEOC guidance.
Yeah, especially if you tie it into the fact that it's related to the getting of the vaccine, as opposed to just sort of giving a reward. I mean, you have to phrase it the right way to provide you as much protection as possible. And then obviously, because salaried employees are dealt with a little bit differently, because you don't track their hours the way that you would normally an hourly employee, and they're entitled to get paid for any hours that work that they perform in the given work week. You can also just talk about just giving regular PTO time as opposed to sort of chopping it up on an hourly basis. Right. Some employers like, well, if I do that, then I'm going to have employees who may take advantage of the situation and say they have symptoms after the second dose just so they don't have to come into work. And I suppose that's a risk. That's part of the evaluation of what's more important to you and making sure that you encourage vaccinations or having the occasional employee who is taking advantage of the situation. I mean, obviously, if you find out that the employee, in fact, did not have symptoms and they were taking advantage of the situation. There are other disciplinary measures that you can take to deal with that employee should you find out that they were being dishonest. But again, you have to sort of weigh the totality of the circumstances to determine if that's something that you're willing to deal with.
Right.
Nikki, any other issues that you've come across with vaccines recently, other than those that we've addressed in our updated podcast?
I don't think that I have seen anything else related to vaccinations other than what we talked about. And I do think there's, certainly you should go back and look at that first podcast because we do talk in detail about the differences between mandating and strongly encouraging and the things that you really need to think very carefully about. So I do think that those are all still very very important considerations. I will say that I think that it's very important and employers should frequently check back with the CDC website because I do think that the CDC has very valuable information on there, and they have broken down the information into categories that are very user friendly. And for example, the things that we were talking about before, when the client calls and says, "This is the scenario. This is what's going on." The CDC has actually broken down. I have an employee, or I'm feeling this. I've gotten my vaccination, but this is what happened. And the CDC does offer very user-friendly guidance on how employers can respond to that. The amount of time that someone should quarantine, if they've been vaccinated, if they haven't been vaccinated, if they've had COVID, if they haven't had COVID, the different scenarios that you might find. It helps break down, what it means to be in close contact. I get a lot of questions now about I'm taking care of someone. My husband has COVID, but I don't. How long do I have to quarantine? Because that's one of those sort of tricky situations where an exposure quarantine is based on the date of last exposure. Well, if you live with someone who has COVID, you're constantly exposed to them. So technically, at least under the old guidance, you wouldn't even start your quarantine period until your wife or husband or whoever you live with is beyond their isolation period, or they've been deemed by a doctor to no longer be contagious. So the CDC does specifically address that as well. And, it sort of accounts for if you've been isolated from that person in your household and that person has made it through their isolation period, then you have, in essence, satisfied the quarantine period. So I would say that employers should definitely access the CDC website. It is broken down. It is very user-friendly. They have charts on there, and it's very helpful to be able to see the different factual scenarios so that employers are better able to determine how they're going to respond to an employee based on the facts that are presented to them.
Just to mention that guidance from the CDC does change frequently. So it's important, even after you watch this podcast, that you refer to the CDC guidelines. They change periodically, or to reach out to one of us. Want to remind people who are watching this that we are a Michigan-based law firm, and our guidance is based on what's going on in the state of Michigan. Michigan does follow the CDC quite heavily in terms of its recommendations. Other states have additional guidelines on top of that, especially if you're dealing with the issue of travel, because other states may have travel quarantine. So be aware of what jurisdiction you may be involved in when you're evaluating these situations. I hope that you have found this podcast to be informational and that helpful to you, but keep in mind that this is not legal advice and it's not meant to relate to your specific situation. Situations are very fact specific and they can vary from time to time. If you have any questions or you would like to discuss your particular situation with us, please feel free to reach out either to Nikki or me. We're in the employment practice section in jaffelaw.com. Thank you, and we wish you good health and a great day.